pours. We're going to start this thing right now. Are you cool with that?
Yeah.
Welcome to this episode of Day Dramming. Today, Danny's going to be educating me on Maker's Mark Bourbon. So I'm excited. This is a staple on just about every liquor shelf in the country. So.
Yeah. It's a good reason for that.
Yeah,
so we're going to start today with a little bit of story time so you can sit back and get relaxed. I'm going to try to get most of the details correct, but Maker's Mark has a pretty good story to go along with it. So in the 60s and 70s, and I'm sure you've heard this story before, so feel free to hop in and correct me if I'm wrong. In the 60s and 70s, whiskey and bourbon were kind of going out in style. It was like the old man's drink. And a lot of the distilleries were rushing out like a higher proofed, they called it a light whiskey. Because they weren't allowed to call it bourbon, they barreled it at a higher proof, and that stripped away a lot of the flavor. So that takes away of what we know of bourbon today. It's just kind of a stripped down, lighter alcohol. When it comes out, has less flavors. And they were trying to compete with vodka, gin, and other clear spirits that were rising at the time. So that was most of the distilleries at the time, and Maker's Mark was one that they kind of leaned into bourbon. As some other brands were moving away from it, they were going to kind of lean into it. Okay. They used a tagline called "It tastes expensive, and it is." And they sold it for 4 times the price of any other whiskey at the time. And I just think that was really, really funny. And I mean, it just paid off. I mean, of all the bottles of bourbon in the world, this is one of the more identifiable ones. You see it everywhere. Yeah. And they helped create a trend back to higher end whiskeys and bourbons, and they were kind of the backbone of the reestablishment of bourbon. So bourbon survived that attack by the clear spirits. Bill Samuel Sr. created the brand after he acquired Burke's Distillery in 1953, but it was actually his wife Marjorie who came up with the name and the wax seal that are so iconic today. So I thought that was really interesting. It's 70% corn, 16% red winter wheat, and 14% malted barley. So there's no rye in there. Rye tends to make it taste a little spicier, and so it's a really smooth drinking bourbon. So that high corn and wheat makes it really, really easy to drink, and it tends to get described as like a crowd pleaser, whereas some crowd pleasers lack a lot of flavor and a lot of once you start to get into drinking bourbon, a lot of people don't want to go back to some of those crowd pleasers. This tends to be held to a pretty high standard. And there was a little bit of a story that I started to research, but I wanted to keep it short, but I can kind of abbreviate it. At one point, the brand, I think this was in like the 80s or the 90s, they wanted to lower the alcohol percentage of Maker's. Yeah, no. There was a really big pushback against that. And so it's still at that, 45% today, which is not a bad alcohol percentage. There are some people that they want to have 100 proof or higher. Right. But for the under 100 proof bourbons, this is still really respected brand. So if we can get right into the nose.
Like most bourbons, this is going to be the first time I've had Maker's Mark.
Yeah. Oh, cheers.
Oh, cheers, yeah. Starting to smell a lot like bourbon.
And this is one before I really got into bourbon. I had some experiences with, and none of them tended to be bad. I mean, I think for newbies and for people who are experienced in bourbon, this is a really nice bottle.
If we go back to the first day dramming we did, when you taught me to kind of open my mouth and breathe through my mouth and nose at the same time when I'm taking it, it totally changes it.
Yeah.
Like I'm just getting a lot more alcohol in my nose. Mm-hmm. There is some subtleness and some flavors I'm getting, but when I kind of take it in and breathe, you can really start to pick up some of that caramelization, some vanilla.
And like I said before, as it sits, it opens up even more, and you get more flavors or smells, I guess. When I'm just smelling through my nose, I almost get exclusively oak and just that alcohol burn. But when I open my mouth, I tend to get especially with this one, a lot of cherries, vanilla, caramel, a little bit of cloves, and that leather smell. Yeah, it's got a really good color. I like Maker's Mark. So one of the most common phrases I would use to describe Maker's Mark is it's really balanced. Like when we did Woodford Double Oaked, that is not a very balanced bourbon. That is all sweet, and I love it for it. But this one, I think one of the reasons it's a big crowd pleaser, it is very balanced. It's not too much of any one thing. You're getting a lot of different flavors that balance each other out. Yep, smooth, it's sweet. I get a lot of like chocolate covered cherries. Growing up, my dad used to be a fan of, you get those little individually packaged chocolate covered cherries at the gas station, and they're just, to me, they're vile. I don't never really liked them, but this smells like I remember those tasting. And at this point, as long as I'm not eating it like a cherry, I like it. It's really nice. But that's what that reminds me of. Get a little like maple syrup, caramel, definitely. But it's all a lot lighter than like that sweet bomb of like a Woodford double oaked. And I like how it finishes. It's very smooth. I get a lot of like cinnamon, like cinnamon candies almost, as it starts to fade out, and it fades slowly and kind of really, really nicely.
So would you put this in that entry level category or slightly above?
I would think that there probably are a lot of people that might not like it the first time they try this, but I would still put it as a entry-level bourbon. I think when I think of like Woodford Double Oaked, I have a hard time believing that any newbie wouldn't like it, just because it's so obvious in the sweetness and the richness. Whereas this one, you do have to dig a little more. It's not going out in the extremes. So it's not as easy to pick up some of those fun flavors and smells.
Well, there you have it. Maker's Mark Bourbon. Good job, bud. Cheers.
Cheers.